Taoiseach, I wish to raise with you some concerns I have around the SUSI student grant scheme for third level students. I wish to do this, however, while also acknowledging the good work that Minister Harris has done and the fact that he has initiated some much needed reform in this area, particularly around the regulations to increase the maintenance grants by €200 and to increase the income threshold for the standard rate of grant by €1,000. That is certainly welcome. But my concern, however, relates specifically to the fact that despite the steering group review of the SUSI scheme and the Minister's action, the income threshold for student holiday earnings has remained capped at the totally unacceptable level of €4,500. I raised the need to increase this earnings limit as part of my own submission to the steering group last March, and I was hopeful, along with others such as the Union of Students of Ireland, that this limit would be changed. Indeed, the last time the level of holiday earnings income was increased was back in 2016, when the cap rose from €3,809 to €4,500. Since that time, students, along with the majority of people in this state, have faced massive and unsustainable levels of rent hikes, travel expenses and food price increases. Yet, despite all of this, the cap on earnings that students can generate for themselves remains at the same level almost 7 years on, and that is totally unacceptable. The fact that it did not change as part of the recent regulations that Minister Harris signed off on was certainly a lost opportunity and one that needs to be addressed and looked at again. I asked the Minister in a recent parliamentary question following his announcement if he would reconsider the decision to leave the cap at €4,500 in terms of student holiday earnings. Minister Harris ruled this out by saying, and I quote, that any further increase to the holiday earnings threshold must be considered in the context of not adversely impacting upon retention rates and the student's ability to primarily focus on successfully completing his or her studies. Taoiseach, I respectfully suggest that it is precisely this rigid inflexibility around student earnings that is creating the difficulties around retention and the ability of students to successfully complete their courses. In other words, a cap that is apparently designed to keep students in college or third level is now acting as a direct disincentive and as a barrier to graduation. This is also having an impact on the retail and hospitality sectors, who cannot source students to do work because the students cannot take on the number of hours that they need. So it's having an impact also, as I say, on hospitality and retail and the students themselves. Taoiseach, I'm specifically requesting that Government and Minister Harris immediately re-examine Article 22(5)(b) of the Student Grant Scheme with a view to increasing the maximum earning caps from 4,500, even if that occurs on an incremental level, equivalent to the increase that took place in 2016.
I want to thank the Deputy for raising this issue, and also I know that you, as you have said, you've made a submission in respect of this to the group looking at the reform of the SUSI scheme. Now, as you said, at the last budget, the Government took a number of decisions to improve the student grant scheme, in particular the increase to all student grant maintenance payments, including the special rate of grant of €200 per year, which will benefit all students entitled to receive a maintenance grant. The income threshold to qualify for the standard rate of student grant increased to 1,000, and the qualifying distance criterion, which is an important one for students to qualify for the non-adjacent rate of grant, will be reduced from 45 kilometres to 30 kilometres. They were all positive measures that the Government took on the last occasion, and also then provided funding, additional funding to the Student Assistance Fund for students in eligible higher education institutions who were experiencing financial difficulties in college. That fund can be very useful to students who are in particular difficulties financially, and also supporting students from some socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds and emergency financial support. That fund now, in 2021-22 academic year, is 18.5 million, which is quite substantial. The Exchequer contributes about 340 million to meeting the tuition fee costs of eligible undergraduate students in higher education and spends 365 million on student grant support via SUSI. In addition, the Exchequer pays the student contribution of 3,000 per annum in full or part for circa 66,000 students. That said, we are conscious that we're anxious to do more, particularly on the student support side and on the SUSI grant side. And we will, in the context of the next budget, examine what more can be done to improve the access to student grants and the various criteria governing the SUSI scheme. We will take on board some of the suggestions, or examine some of the suggestions that you have made in the context of the estimates for the the subsequent academic year beyond the next budget. And that's the context in which this will be looked at. I think you make reasonable points. I think there is a balance to be struck in terms of what Minister Harris has said, to be fair, in terms of maintaining focus on study and so on, but equally the threshold perhaps is an area that can be examined into the future in terms of the earnings cap at 4,500. So we'll certainly examine that.
I think the real problem here is that the cap of €4,500 in terms of student earnings is extremely low. And given that we have inflation and indeed people struggling to cope with the costs of living, students are no different. We have spiralling rent costs, as I outlined earlier. So it would make sense, and indeed it would act as an incentive in ensuring that we're investing in our students in this country and not having a situation where they're emigrating abroad because they're forced to leave education here. And unfortunately, this is a barrier. The student earning cap is a barrier that does force many students out of third level education, where they just cannot pay, as I said, for accommodation and different costs of living demands. So I would ask that maybe this be looked at, and that if we were to increase it incrementally over a period of time, and if that could be done in Budget 23, or indeed a start made on this, I would accept that it can't be all done at once, or that we can't get up to the rate that we would like to be up at all at once. But I do think that it needs to be seriously looked at in Budget 2023, because, as I say, we're failing our students. Our brightest and our best are forced to drop out of education.
To conclude.
Yeah, well, first of all, there is very significant investment in third level education by government. And participation rates are continuing to increase in Ireland. We have perhaps one of the highest participation rates in third level education across the European Union, and we have one of the highest second level completion rates. The issue, though, will be, the first priority has to be to make sure that our third level institutions have an adequacy of core funding to ensure a quality education for all those who access third level. That has to be the priority. And there is a gap there, which the recent report that the Minister received, there's a significant gap in terms of what the universities and the institutes of technology require to narrow that gap in terms of core funding in our third level institutions. Secondly, we do need to reform the student grant scheme as we can, if resources permit. In terms of ensuring access, particularly for young people from disadvantaged background, and particularly postgraduate education. Postgraduate education needs to be made more accessible from a cost perspective.